This is episode 132 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, normally this is the news of the week episode where we discuss the hot topics in the area of limited government individual liberty for the state of New Mexico. But in this particular podcast, it's kind of one big bomb dropped, metaphorically, in New Mexico, which is Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham putting out a proposal, at least the outlines of a proposal, to make college free, quote unquote, very important, for New Mexicans. This is, she's calling it, and I think it's an apt description. She's calling it her moonshot for education, and it's obviously going to be a big push. But initially, Wally, what are your thoughts on the plan for free college?
Well, as your quote unquote, as your air quotes across the table here in the studio indicate, nothing is free, and this is an economic question to an economic issue. And yes, if the goal is to make the lives and the economy and the state of New Mexico be all that it can be, to steal a phrase from the Army, the outcome no one would disagree with. But is this the right way to do it? Is this really the case that we need to make? And there's, once you get past the fact that, oh yeah, sounds great, the who pays for it, what would the real impact be, and is it going to be a net positive if it were to be implemented in New Mexico? Because New Mexico has the lottery scholarship that used to pay for all tuition past the first semester. It's been adjusted a little bit. It still pays substantial. And that has not necessarily been the positive educational or economic driver for the state. And so will this be taking something that on first blush sounds great, that when we look back, we're like, hey, that didn't do what we wanted it to do? And I think it deserves really serious analysis.
No doubt about it. So let's start with some of the rudimentary outlines. And quite frankly, one of the things that I really would like to see is a more in-depth analysis put out by the powers that be, the governor's office, somebody to describe what we are really talking about here. We know some of the details, which is, first and foremost, this is a last dollar program, not a first dollar program. What does that mean? Well, in a first dollar free college program, if you were a young person who wanted to go to college, the government would just come in with a check, and not just check for tuition, but fees as well. And at some of New Mexico's universities and colleges, I'm speaking of UNM primarily, those fees are very, very expensive as well. But in a first dollar program, you would just have the government step in with the money, and it would be a situation where you wouldn't even have to worry about, applying for student aid and getting the lottery scholarship or any of those other programs, Pell Grants from the federal government, etc. You would have the state of New Mexico come in with all the money. That's not what she's proposing. What she's proposing is the so-called last dollar. In theory, and this is where theory is going to bump up against reality, in theory, students are going to be getting the scholarships that they can get, including the lottery scholarships, including financial aid, and then the state will step in with the check to cover what is uncovered by those other scholarship opportunities. Now, that obviously leaves a big gaping hole question of how does the state of New Mexico's new Office of Free College Education ensure that young people, and it's been a while, but I've done the FAFSA paperwork, free application for student aid. It's a federal form. And Wally, you have kids. And
I've done it, yes, many times.
It's a pain in the butt.
Yes.
It is a huge pain in the rear, but you got to do it if you're looking at college. Now, the question is, how does the state of New Mexico ensure that all of its young people are beating the bushes, going out, finding all of these scholarship opportunities, including but not limited to the scholarship from the lottery? You've got, I know in a lot of states where you have certain ethnic communities, you have the German American, Oompa tuba club that got together, and sorry, I'm German American, so not that I played the tuba, but you have all these different ethnic groups and whatnot that come together and have a scholarship for their various group. You have military, you have scholarships provided through ROTC programs and other institutions. How do you ensure that students in New Mexico go and beat the bushes to find all these scholarships? You got me, Wally. You any ideas there?
Well, no, you get what you incentivize, and so if there's a bare minimum requirement, and then they'll pay for the rest, that's what's going to happen. But you brought up the fees issue, a big issue, tuition and fees. But the other thing that is a big issue that is where this program might have some unintended consequences is that if you're going to go to UNM, University Near Mom, meaning you live in Albuquerque and you're going to go here, much of your education may be paid for. But if you live in Albuquerque and you go to New Mexico State, you may have full tuition and fees and even books. Room and board is big. It's also a big hindrance to lower income and middle income people to send their kids outside of a location where they live. So this is a big issue. Now, the way the Pell Grant works is my understanding, a lot of the students who qualified for that can use it for room and board. But we're just talking tuition and fees here right now from what I have seen. So I just wanted to bring that. It's like, this is the total cost of ownership. You have to get yourself to college. You have to stay somewhere. You have to eat. You have to pay your tuition. You have to have your books. It's all one big package. And so, as we've seen kind of with programs designed to overcome poverty, sometimes putting money in one place would reduce benefits from another place. And what I'm saying is the devil's in the details. And I think questions like that need a full analysis before we figure out what that's really going to mean for many different categories of students.
Yeah. And at this point, we're talking about questions and aspects of the proposal. One of the questions I have, and Wally, you bring up a very good point, room and board, and does that incentivize then students to just stay home because that's what they can afford? They're getting subsidized for the fees and the tuition, so they might not be able to afford to relocate and pay the rent in Las Cruces, say, if they live in Albuquerque or wherever. Or
Socorro. New Mexico Tech has a relatively unique set of programs that you can't get anywhere else, that you would not go there because you would stay where you live and maybe get a degree that's suboptimal for your economic future.
Exactly. Now, all of this is supposed to be achieved for the low cost of between $25 and $35 million annually cost to taxpayers.
That's amazing that it's that low. When I saw that, I was like, 25 million? Done. But there's got to be more to it than that.
So just on and again, how do you ensure that you have the students obtaining the current status quo dollars through other means to fund their college tuitions? But I did a little looking online, a little research. Just at UNM, just at the University of New Mexico, this is budgetoffice.unm.edu, and you have to go to the consolidated budget. Tuition and fees just at the University of New Mexico. Now, this is all campuses, and it is for the year 2020. So next, kind of next year, if you will, total tuition and fees collected by the university are $211 million. $211,275,000. Now, I have not seen a detailed statement or detailed proposal by the governor's office explaining how they come to the $25 to $35 million number. But if the University of New Mexico alone is collecting $200 million, $211 million in tuition and fees, yeah, the lottery scholarship's there, but it's not covering 100% these days. It's covering 60 some odd percent. Yes, you have some out-of-staters and international students, but out-of-state is 10% and international is 2%. You're looking at a current cost of total tuition and fees across the UNM system, let alone in MSU and all the other branch campuses and whatnot, that far surpasses $25 to $35 million. Is that really all that it takes to pay for the college tuitions of the students who might choose to attend Institute of Higher Learning in New Mexico? Of course, it's like anything. When you put something out there that is quote unquote free, you're going to have a lot of people enter into that system that are not currently there. So what I'm asking for and what I'm trying to get out of the folks at the governor's office is, where do they come up with that number? Because I think $25 to $35 million is extremely low. I think it is low to the point of absolute inaccuracy.
Now, when you look at those numbers, Paul, that $211 million number, would that, from how you viewed it initially, probably include all the lottery scholarships would be in that number, because that's tuition and fees, all the Pell Grants, all the the federal aid also in there, or could you tell, or would that be brought in somewhere separately?
So according to this spreadsheet, it would, I believe, be included in that. But even if you do include that, I still think that there's more than $25 to $35 million, even at University of New Mexico, that would be unpaid for. There needs to be a serious analysis of this proposal done by the governor, by the legislative committees and legislature before this thing is really put forth, because it doesn't take dynamic scoring to understand. Oh, and there's so much data out here and so much information. If you go, and I think this is one of those areas where Wikipedia is probably as good a source as any. They list all the U.S. states by educational attainment. New Mexico currently, 26.9% of the population in New Mexico has a bachelor's degree or higher. That is ranked 39th in the country. So yes, a lot of students go to college and drop out, but how many of those students are not going to choose to attend college? How many new students are going to enter the system? And those are probably going to be the students who have the least amount of support currently behind them. Of course, if you're dealing with the lottery scholarship is a fixed pie of money. New students who are attracted to go to school in New Mexico aren't going to be generating more lottery scholarship dollars. They're going to be using the same pot of lottery scholarship money that's already funding existing attendees. So you're going to have a dilution, not an enhancement of that lottery scholarship money available. And with 26.9% of the population obtaining a bachelor's degree in New Mexico, how much of a benefit is the other 73% of our state getting? Is this a regressive tax or a regressive government program, I should say? It's not a tax in this particular case, although if it was funded by a tax increase, it would definitely be a regressive program. But because it's this quote unquote free money from the oil patch, it doesn't have the same ring to it in terms of taxation. Of course, Rio Grande Foundation has been working diligently to provide other alternatives, but with is this a regressive government program, Wally? I guess I'll ask that.
Well, and I think it could be doing a little brief research in anticipation of this issue. I came across Richard Vedder, who is an economics professor emeritus, so he can speak more honestly now that he's retired from Ohio University.
I know Richard.
Yes, and his analysis was that it might free college might be a net economic negative to a society, or in this case to a state, because you would get more and more people that would be incentivized, but they wouldn't get the full benefit because of dropout, other things. While his study, or at least the report on it, didn't talk about it. The other thing is that when these sums of money are made available in anything, so if government money is made available for things, it's easy to ramp up your spending to match any amount of money that's there. And one of the issues that I believe higher education across the country is going to have to address in one way or another is the value for the cost of what that education is. I do think there are certain degrees that without question are still have a huge ROI to the individual and to society, but there's others that the quote unquote socialization skills and the exposure to the great works of history aren't necessarily justified in what has been invested. Now, right now, a lot of that student loans in addition to federal aid and other things. But if it's a bad investment, potentially under the current system, does the state of New Mexico paying for it make it a good investment for people? And again, I love college. I have a college degree. My children and stepchildren all went to college. I'm all, it's one of those, I'm certainly not a hater on college, but this is not a universal good where no matter how much money you put into it and how few people graduate with whatever degrees, it's always going to be a good thing. It's like many other things in our economy. There are pros and cons, there's costs and benefits. I think we need to take a really, what would we say, strategic look at this, even in that regard, as opposed to this is good. Everyone gets a chance to try college, whether they're likely to finish, whether they want to go, or that's just the easy place to hang out for a few years till they flunk out.
Yeah. And there's so many ways to go just with that particular point. I'll bring something to your attention. I posted on Heirs of Enchantment in response to this plan that the national kind of interest group for higher education, it's the State Higher Education Officers, SHEEO, Education Executive Officers Association, according to their report, per $1,000 of personal income, New Mexico is the second most generous spender when it comes to higher education. So when you look at our low incomes, New Mexico is spending a relatively high proportion of our money on higher education already. So first and foremost, I'll again throw the question out there. Has this investment paid off for New Mexico to date? What are the challenges that young people in K-12, which is not performing particularly well, what are they going to face when they get to higher education? Are you going to have a higher education system that dumbs itself down even further? I would argue, and a lot of academics do as well, that the system has already been dumbed down to the equivalent of maybe what a high school education might be in past years. You have a 2.5% GPA limit, according to the governor's proposal. Will now students be lobbying, protesting, trying to get their professors fired if they don't get enough in the GPA area to keep that scholarship? Because you're talking about a huge financial hit to those young people who might not be academically qualified or prepared for higher education, for a college diploma, who think it's their birthright now, thanks to the governor and her program. So, there's a lot to unpack there, Wally, but I'll throw it back to you.
Well, I do think these are very good questions. college is not for everybody. And interestingly, some of the most accomplished people of my generation didn't have college degrees. You know, the tech companies over the past 20, 30 years have not been dominated by college graduates. They've been dominated by entrepreneurs. And that is an interesting factor. So I don't want to make it seem like college you're in, your life's successful, without college you're out. There's this whole controversy about other forms of vocational education, which for some reason has almost become a slur, or something that is like, oh, how dare you put somebody in that, when some of the most successful businesses and successful people in our economy not only don't have, but don't need a college degree to do something. And then again, more questions than answers. From a New Mexico point of view, the reason I always felt that comprehensive policy is so hugely important is I think even under our current system, some of our best and brightest that do go to New Mexico State, do go to University of New Mexico, do go to New Mexico Tech and the other colleges across the state, when they graduate, because the economic conditions here have been struggling, they're going to Phoenix, they're going to Denver, they're going to Austin, they're going to Southern and Northern California. So while we're paying a great deal to educate our students, they're going elsewhere. And we don't have a proportionate number of the best and brightest from other states coming here. So there's this interesting void that's created. As a holistic system, it's not working. Now, you can argue if there's a circle that's broken, where's the circle that's broken? And maybe it's broken in several places. So that's another consideration that I've had when it comes to things like this, because I've seen that over the past decade, the kind of so-called lost decade in New Mexico, where our economic growth is just now, just barely now in the past year or so gotten to where it was before the economic downturn of the 2008 period. But all this is not necessarily, it may be doing great for our kids who go elsewhere, but not a great return for the state.
Yeah. And if I was in the same room as Governor Lujan Grisham and wanted to have a conversation about her, knowing that she views this as, her moonshot, something that's going to be a centerpiece of her policy agenda moving forward, that would be the first question I would ask her is, what jobs are going to be available for our young people with these college degrees when they get out? What are you going to do to make sure that our economy is in a position to put these folks to work and to compete with the neighboring states, the Texases and the Arizonas and the Colorados, not to mention Southern Californias and other places, because if we as taxpayers, if we as in the oil and gas industry of New Mexico put all this money into a system that doesn't result in people ultimately paying back into the state of New Mexico, how is that going to help our economic future? And maybe that is a point that in the legislative debates over this proposal, it's pretty nonpartisan or pretty, it's not ideological to say, do you want to put in some kind of strings attached to this scholarship money and say, if you get above X amount of money or if there's this, that, or the other, then you have to work for a couple of years in New Mexico, preferably not New Mexico government, because the last thing we need is to artificially grow New Mexico government by mandating that people go back to work for the state or city or county or whoever. But what about adding a requirement in that they spend a couple years? Now, that doesn't mean I think this is a good idea on its own, but I think that question needs to be asked is, what is this going to do for New Mexico's economy? And the other thing that I have is, we do need more vocational learning to happen in this state. We do need more people who can do electric and plumbing and those kinds of things. Now, one aspect of this is C&M or a community college may be the best place for them to learn their craft, but the price of, to you and I, or to the student, I should say, the price in tuition of a community college in New Mexico is a tiny fraction of what a degree at UNM is going to cost. Why would somebody who may be interested in a vocational career decide to forego that for a 2-year degree at CNM? May they feel like they are getting the short end of the stick here? Or maybe they've gotten all their vocational education done in high school at one of the vocational schools there. I just think you're going to set up a bad incentive structure for people, young people, who feel like, hey, this pot of money is sitting there. I should take advantage of the pot of money because it exists, not because it's the right decision for me. It is the best thing for me to do and in my best interest.
Yeah, if I remember right, all of this was post-college, but there's something that's called the endowment factor in consumer economics, where if you're given free money, you tend to treat it differently than if it was money that you basically have skin in the game or investing yourself. You make different decisions, not always for the overall highest benefit. And before we get away from the moonshot idea, interestingly, in one of the last people to walk on the moon was Jack Schmidt, a New Mexican, grew up in Silver City, actually a classmate of my mother's. I met him, great guy. This moonshot metaphor
drives me up a wall, Wally.
Well, here's the thing. It's been 47, 48 years since we've been on the moon. So we did the moon shot and we proved that we did it. But we don't want education in New Mexico to be something where we dump a lot of money in and get a lot of short-term activity without long-term benefit towards the state and towards all involved. And so just the fact that we haven't been to the moon in almost 50 years shows that, maybe this would be a moonshot, dumping a lot of money in, maybe accomplishing something in the short term. But the point of it is we need it to be a systemic accomplishment that really does benefit the state.
Yeah. And another aspect of this is the potential, heaven forbid this would actually happen, Wally, but when bureaucracies are presented with unlimited opportunities to increase their size, increase their budgets, when they are given literally unlimited money, bureaucracies tend to have a opportunity to grow. Then they have an incentive to grow and expand and not exactly constrain costs.
Well, and I think the current system is already nationwide and certainly in New Mexico contributed to that. It's just the whole cost benefit equation is certainly different than you see in most other industries that don't have such a heavy-handed government piece of it. And then to put more government in it, there was a lot, and again, not to make this about healthcare, but there was a lot of government in healthcare before quote unquote Obamacare, and it just added a little bit more. There's nothing about the college funding system with the FAFSA and all of the federal financial aid guaranteed student loans that looks very free market. And as a result, I think if you look long-term over college prices, they've grown a lot faster than inflation. Is this going to slow that trend, which I believe really needs to be slowed down? I think, in fact, just the opposite. And so is that trying to put out a fire of ever-increasing college costs by dumping gasoline on it? That's something that New Mexico needs to take a strategic look at as well.
Yeah, and the point is, and Wally, you made it pretty darn well, higher education prices, the cost of higher education has been going up very, very quickly over the last few decades. In that particular case, it is largely the student loan program the federal government offers, but also the fact that it is a taxpayer-financed group of institutions with very limited competition between them, and that drives the costs up. There's a cultural imperative that a lot of middle to upper income people feel that they have to send their kids to college, even if it's not the best thing for them. Maybe they should get some job experience first. You could make the case that you're going to see a lot of older people like senior citizens, folks who have been in the careers for a long time, just going and taking classes at institutes of higher learning because it's quote unquote free to them. So I don't know what barriers you're going to have, but with this new source of money, this allegedly free college, there really needs to be a discussion within the legislation about specific metrics that the institutes have to be held to. They can't just keep students in there and pseudo encourage them to be 5, 6, 7, the Animal House model.
Yeah, the 12-year associate's degree.
Right. And they can't just grow their bureaucracies, grow the number of branch campuses, all the things that we have criticized about higher education. And they also need to be somehow encouraged to be honest brokers, calling balls and strikes when students are in these institutions and their free college is hinging on a 2.5 GPA, that there's not an institutional pressure there. While anybody, no offense, but anyone with a heartbeat can basically walk into UNM and do a American Studies degree or English degree or heck, even a poli-sci degree like me. You don't need a whole lot on the ball to get one of those degrees. But if you're going down to New Mexico Tech and you're taking a hard science physics degree or something at one of the toughest, best schools in the entire country, that could be a real battle, real war, if you will, on that 2.5% GPA issue with some of these places. And this is the same criticism or thought we had about the lottery scholarship and making it GPA reliant. The last thing we want to do is encourage young people in particular to go for softer, less science, less math intensive degrees for the sole purpose of coming out with a diploma, as opposed to sticking with the STEM and the harder stuff that's going to be more challenging. A lot of places, a 2.5 is a badge of honor, not a walk of shame kind of situation.
Well, absolutely, yeah. And two issues to follow on with the point you're making. One, grade inflation. Grades are not a constant. They're like the dollar. It's what does it buy? So, it used to be a long, long time ago, a 2.5 was not considered a shameful bad undergrad grade point average. Now 2.5 in most fields of studies considered almost flunking out. The other issue, as you said, is not all courses of study are created equal. I just know from my experience at the little Southern Cal College when I was there, I got a business degree, and Paul, not to brag, just to put it out there, I was highest honors in the business. I was the number one student in the business college. The amount of work I had to do to obtain that paled compared to my colleagues that were eking out 2.5 and 3.0 and 3.1s in the engineering college. Their course of study was so much more rigorous that, basically a 2.0 grade point average GPA business student back then was really nothing that to be proud of. It's actually something to be ashamed of. Where a 2.1 engineering degree in your last couple years, that meant you still had to do an awful lot of work and you gained an awful lot of knowledge. So yeah, these are issues. And just like I say, just like in currency, it's what does it buy? What does that number really mean? And if the schools need to have 2.5s to keep their dollars coming in the door, I have a feeling 2.5 may be the floor. So instead of a 0 grade point average, 2.5 may be the lowest you can get, and you go up from there.
You got it. Well, kind of on the flip side of this whole program is we just saw, Wally, students, at least in Albuquerque, but also across the country, walked out of their classrooms last week to protest climate change. And I think Trevor, the cartoonist of the Albuquerque Journal, really put this into a great visual in his Sunday cartoon, where he showed a young person pumping up their car, but it was labeled, free college, and then you've got all the environmental folks marching around against college. Now, anyone in the industry will be glad to tell you just how much of New Mexico's K-12 and higher education are directly dependent on the oil and gas industry. But is this in some ways the governor tipping her hand, if you will, to not take the radical environmental opposition to the fossil fuel industry advocated by the young people in the streets across the country? Or, let's walk through that whole thing, because I think in some ways, if you're in oil and gas, and trust me, the folks at Namoga are very pleased with this proposal, because you have the seated governor, a potential adversary, a Democrat who will get plenty of pressure politically to take on the oil and gas industry, who is essentially doubling down on our dependency on this particular industry and saying, I am going to use this industry, which many of my political allies and my base are pretty skeptical about, and I'm going to put a bold new financial proposal on the back of that industry. I think it's an interesting dynamic, Wally. It's worth working through.
Well, if that is indeed what happens, that I think would be a positive development if we are not going to try to kick oil and gas out of New Mexico as an industry. But it's not that many years ago when, in a far different economic climate, Bill Richardson benefited from the largesse of, back then, a run-up in natural gas prices in northwest New Mexico that created a lot of funding that allowed him to do things, while he simultaneously did a lot of regulation above and beyond what existed in surrounding oil and gas production states. So he actually sort of did bite the hand that fed him, but we have this issue of timing. So sometimes the things that you do today might not be felt, whether they're good or bad, until years in the future. So that could be part of the calculus too, is you could say, well, I'm going to do both. I'm going to do this free college, and I'm going to beat on oil and gas to make the rules at some of the most stringent in the country. But by the time that really takes the revenue down, I will be gone and be elsewhere. So that's the flip side from a political calculus point of view. And I have no idea which of those two scenarios, or likely somewhere in the middle, that would all come together.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And to be fair, the governor has not taken a overtly anti-oil and gas stand so far. She didn't, there was no bills that passed the legislature, and I'm sure they could have if she'd given her blessing to them, to really crack down on, say, a ban on fracking or some kind of bold anti-oil and gas initiative. She, of course, did sign the Energy Transition Act, which takes on energy production and coal in northwestern New Mexico. But this is, quite frankly, a very different ball of wax for the state of New Mexico. And we at the Rio Grande Foundation are going to be working very hard on this particular issue. We're going to be, first and foremost, trying to get a fuller explanation of the real financials here. And one of the things, Wally, and we just have a couple minutes left in the podcast, and it's a double-edged sword, is, as I understand it, I haven't seen this specifically, but I believe the requirement is you have to graduate from an institute of K-12 in New Mexico,
right?
Which mirrors the lottery scholarship. There's an element of this proposal that I almost think they should use it as a talent recruitment tool to attract people from other states
to come here for your senior year in New Mexico.
Exactly.
Yes.
Now, that again creates do we have the jobs and economic conditions right to employ our own young people, let alone more talented young people? But I wouldn't trust the government to do this. But hey, if New Mexico's got a particular need, open it up to X, Y, and Z majors, like engineers or some kind of specific need that we have. Of course, the politics get into play there, and it becomes very tricky very quickly. But
my whipping boy of degrees is German poetry, because having a German last name, I feel like it might be safe to do that with me. And if poetry sounds as ugly as in German as every other thing does, how good can it be?
Right up there with my tuba players.
Yeah, there you go. So,
all right,
we are not German haters. We have German last names. So.
Drangmeister, yes, I would say so. All right. Well, we are going to keep an eye on this, but we really wanted to do a deep dive and understand and ask some of the questions that I think need to be answered as we move, as the state and the legislature move forward towards potentially quote unquote free higher education. And thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point, New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.